Hey everybody, welcome back to Us as a Podcast. I'm your host, Kieran Watts. Thank you for joining. Please like, please subscribe. COVID-19, of course, is the issue, the public health issue that we've all been thinking about for well over a year now. But it's important to remember that there are other ones, and among them is tobacco use. So I'm very privileged to be joined today by the president of the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World, Dr. Derek Yach, joining me from the great state of Connecticut.
Hi.
Hello, Dr. Yach. How are you?
Well, thank you. Good to see you. Good afternoon to you all.
Thank you for being here. As I mentioned, you're obviously the president of the Foundation for Smoke-Free World. But you've had an extensive career in public health. You've worked with the WHO. So just, could you introduce yourself to the people watching, your career and what you've been up to for so long?
Well, thank you. Yes, I'm from South Africa. I did medicine in South Africa, and when I graduated, my first focus was as an epidemiologist. It was still apartheid was still in existence, and we were able to create a national center to initially focus on inequalities by race and social class across the country, to find what are the interventions that we needed to actually close the gap, particularly between Black and white South Africans. We started doing interesting work on chronic diseases, tobacco, tuberculosis. And when Mandela was finally released and a democratic government came in, South Africa regained their membership of the World Health Organization. And I was recruited as the first South African to join WHO over 30 years. And I went initially thinking I'd be there a year and spent 10 years there. The last 5 years was working on a treaty to address tobacco control, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which was the first time the World Health Organization had used its treaty-making right. From then, when Gro Harlem Brundtland, known by many as the mother of sustainable development, she'd been the Prime Minister of Norway. When she left at the end of her first term, we realized it was going back to be a more bureaucratic UN agency than we had experienced. And so I took an offer to head global health at Yale, then went on to a few other things in the US, the Rockefeller Foundation, before Indra Nooyi became the CEO of PepsiCo and recruited me to work within the company to address how you lower salt, sugar, fat, and transform the food portfolio. I went on from then into a very exciting health promoting incentive program, which you'd know in the UK under the name of Vitality, which is known for fun and iconic ways of incentivizing health behavior, and led the development of a global effort here while the program was expanding across a number of Asian and European countries, all asking the question, how do we nudge people into healthier lifestyles? How do we do far more to promote physical activity, reduce smoking, better weight control? And in that process, I went back to my roots on tobacco and realized we'd made very little progress in addressing adult smoking. And so started digging into the issues of harm reduction and where they were going, which eventually led to the creation of the foundation.
I want to be completely transparent. I myself am a smoker. I didn't tell you that. I didn't know if you'd accept the invitation. If I told you I was.
Well, that doesn't it doesn't affect me one way or the other. In fact, it's good to know. I think one of the things we've seen, and I've spoken about in tobacco control, is that we have systematically cleansed the tobacco control movement of smokers, which has meant that the very people we're supposed to be helping and supporting are no longer part of the ranks. And I think the one thing I learned over the last few years is to go back to the AIDS experience, where the AIDS activists said, nothing for us without us. We need to have people who are HIV positive to be part of the decision making. You'll be pleased to know that my secretary at WHO was a smoker. And I remember when I hired her, she told me sort of quietly, I hate to tell you, but I'm a smoker. And I said, Anne, you're the best secretary here. She said, well, how would you feel about having me? I said, I'm thrilled to have you. And it was a great partnership.
No, because I watched today, oddly enough, I watched quite a spirited debate on British television about banning smoking outside outside like hospitality businesses, outside a public house or a restaurant. And the one person who was arguing in favor of it said, I think we should go further and ban smoking in all public places. Um, so basically, you could only smoke in your own home or your garden. And the rejoinder was sort of, but you're just going to alienate people there. So it's a fascinating response that smokers need to be part of the solution, not excluded from it. For want of a better word, for the conversation to be didactic and almost infantilizing, I think.
Well, I think particularly now that we are seeing that the data on smoking cessation has stalled in many parts of the world, suggesting that the adult smoker is not getting what they want from the current products out there. And many, maybe a majority in most places, do want to reduce their risks, but they want to continue to getting some of the pleasure that they perceive that they're getting. And that discussion has virtually gone off the table. Certainly, it's not one that you could have at WHO, because I said they've banned smokers from actually becoming part of the staff at WHO. There isn't a place where you'd interface with smokers. And the very notion of talking to smokers has been wiped off the table of most policy folk, as well as the researchers, meaning that they're deciding what is in the best interest of a smoker. And they often are making decisions which are not in their best interest and may actually be making the issues worse.
I want to come to the FCTC that you mentioned just a moment ago. I want to go a bit deeper into that. So could you explain in a bit more detail what the FCTC is, why it matters?
Sure. So it's the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. So a framework convention is a set of international guidance around a major topic where there are particularly cross-border issues which need to be addressed. So think of the climate change conventions. Those are classic. They preceded the tobacco ones by well over a decade. Or international disarmament is another example. In both of those cases, what is required is that governments need to agree to take action, particularly on the cross-border transnational issues, recognizing that most governments are not going to allow for supranational organizations to come in and affect their national laws, but they're willing to adopt them according to what they're doing. So the Framework Convention, really, you can see that it arose at a time when multilateralism in the international system was still strongly supported in the mid-90s, when you had the Prime Minister of Norway, ex-Prime Minister, driving the process. And she was the one who brought in a lot of the international environmental treaties. So she understood the politics of this, which helped us. It was also, I think, a unique time. I would say since then, the world has moved away from multilateralism with a number of really complicated political realities facing us. The Chinese, the Americans, the Europeans, the Russians are very difficult to actually bring together in the way we were able to on the Framework Convention. So for 5 years, we would hold regular meetings where every single member state, every government would send its representatives, and we'd fight over the text on what would make the biggest difference. And the components of the Framework Convention were built on the 30 years experience that went before of many countries putting in place taxes, smoke-free public places, bans or restrictions on advertising, addressing R&D. All of those elements were then put into the Framework Convention. Some of them were regarded as weaker than the best that countries had, but for most countries, this was the first time they were considering the issue, particularly the low middle income countries, who used the process almost as a university to gain knowledge about why and how they could tackle what was either a current problem or one that was going to come down the line. So at the end of 5 years, and now several years later, 182 or so countries have formally adopted it, which means that they take it into their national legislation in some way. The results 15 years later of the entire process suggest there has been modest progress, particularly on youth uptake, and that we may be at the start of a slow decline in the demand for tobacco. And by tobacco, I'm talking about combustible cigarettes, cigars, smokeless products, the whole range. But we have seen very little progress on adults. And I think we recognized that smoking cessation was a critical part of it. Now, if you also go back and ask the question, what did we say about harm reduction in the Framework Convention? Very interestingly, we anticipated its importance. And in the very definition of tobacco control, in the preamble of the convention, it includes tobacco control is defined as including harm reduction from the beginning. That was recognized. In fact, during the early workshops, we invited the tobacco industry to WHO headquarters to answer the question, what are you currently doing that would actually help us accelerate harm reduction products? And BAT, Philip Morris, a number of other companies sent their scientists, and they gave their presentations to a tobacco regulatory committee. That was the first and last time they were invited to WHO headquarters. And then, unfortunately, I would say, the shutters came down, and the decision was made during the convention process that there would be no discussion, no interaction. There'd be a complete ban and boycott of the tobacco industry, even though I always felt then, well before starting the foundation, that there were always two areas where there would be a requirement to engage industry, whether you like them or not. And that was understanding how they were progressing on the science. If they were, and it could advance public health, we have to know about it and apply it. And secondly, the approaches to dealing with illicit trade, and provided they were operating in a very positive way, that would have an incredible impact on trying to address the central, most important intervention that countries have, namely taxes and the ability to affect price.
I want to come to the foundation because you mentioned Philip Morris, which is obviously backing the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World. And if I were to say that to somebody, a lot of people would probably go, what? Because obviously Philip Morris is a tobacco company. Backing something called the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World would seem, antithetical to, who they are, to their business. Does that association between the foundation and its goals and a company like Philip Morris, does that ever worry you?
Well, it's obviously so the elephant in the room question, which has to be asked and has to be addressed openly. So let's just go back to when we started and why I started talking to them in the first place. It was 2015. I was asked by the Spectator, the Spectator is and they have a health section. So the editor of the health section said to me, we'd like an update on what's going on in the e-cigarette world. And I wanted to do it because I wanted to apply it in our health promotion programs. And I must say I was shocked at how little I knew at the time. I hadn't been following the debate. And what I found and wrote about was that the world of harm reduction was starting to open up. It was starting to be real. There was evidence then across Europe that smokers were preferring to switch from a cigarette to an e-cigarette than to the patch and the gum. They were able to get the nicotines that they wanted. I also reviewed the evidence on snus, the Swedish product that is still banned across the European Commission. And the evidence had got much stronger over the years and it helped explain why Swedish men had some of the lowest cancer rates in Europe, if not the world, because they were using snus and not combustible cigarettes. And this all then led Philip Morris to reach out and say, well, if you think e-cigarettes and snus are great, we've got to tell you about what we're doing on our heated tobacco product, IQOS. And I saw the laboratories, spent quite a bit of time with the scientists, saw what's starting to happen in Japan. And that was just the beginning. And the CEO then and I discussed the fact that a foundation may very well be able to accelerate an end to smoking and the death caused by combustion. And obviously, it would address other things. And so that is how we got to form a foundation where Philip Morris involvement is as a funder, but they have no role on the board selection, the board decisions, the independence and decision on the specific research projects we have. They don't get to see research before it goes public for good or for bad. They don't have a way of engaging directly with the board and telling them what they must do. Whereas there are many foundations where they are either the founder is sitting on the board. We went to extreme lengths to look at what did the public health community say are the best ways of assuring independence. Open science, transparency of putting your research out there. All of these things were built into the very legal structure of the foundation, which, by the way, is also required under the very tough conditions of the IRS approving you to be a nonprofit. So I feel very comfortable that we are truly independent. I see it every day. But of course, the public perception and many of the critics don't accept it. And I think they are muddled up with two really issues that are intertwined. The first is the historic reality, and still today in some extent, that the tobacco industry has thwarted public policy, that it has played a very negative role on the direction of research and often undermined the very research on the harms caused by tobacco. That's been documented for decades. Secondly, there's a deep revulsion inside the tobacco control movement, many, about harm reduction. And I think part of it is the fear of what happened with low tar and low nicotine cigarettes in the 90s, that they didn't play out the way they wanted. And they think this is just another trick by the tobacco industry. Against that backdrop, I've jumped from 2015 to 2021, June 2021, where we are today. Just look at the data. So we have 100 million people around the world who voted, smokers, who voted to either get onto a heated tobacco product, an e-cigarette or vape, or a snus or pouch. Just on the heated tobacco area, we've probably now got 20, 25 million people in the world, of which the majority are not using a combustible cigarette at all. Now, the FDA, as many people may know, authorized IQOS to actually carry a reduced risk claim, which means that they have assessed the evidence and judged that in the public health world, the net benefit to smokers of people switching to that product is substantial. Now, as a public health person, that is good news. That means less death, less disease.
I agree.
So
I agree with you, sir, and I totally think that any gain is better than no gain. But part of the reason why I asked, other than the fact that, as you said, it's sort of the elephant in the room question, is that you mentioned 2015, and then 2 years later, Reuters broke the story about the FCTC being actively undermined by Philip Morris International in documents. So I suppose what I want to kind of get to the heart of is that document that you were so instrumental in formulating. Does it sort of make you uncomfortable that the foundation is backed by someone who actively worked to undermine a linchpin of your legacy as a public health professional?
You know, I think one has to be really honest about this. And it's not popular to say it, but you must remember that before the formal negotiations started on the convention, we commissioned the only report ever commissioned in the UN on a set of companies using the litigation documents that came out of the US to look at how the tobacco industry had tried to thwart WHO policy. And that was put out publicly before the negotiations started. And it basically put governments and the industry on notice that we were going to watch them. During the actual negotiations, yes, of course, there were efforts to lobby and push and whatever, but I can't say that the outcome was affected in any major or negative way by the efforts of the tobacco industry. Now, many people may disagree, but They've got to show the evidence. What exactly did they achieve that we didn't actually overcome as a strong secretariat with a set of governments who were very committed to progress? Remember, there were there's still enormous government interest at stake. And we were aware then, but we've recently published so much more on the fact that when we think about big tobacco, who do we put in the camp? Well, Philip Morris, BAT, Japan Tobacco, Imperial, for example. Well, if you take those four, add up their sales worldwide, they don't come close to the really big tobacco, the Chinese state monopoly, who produce 44% of the world's combustible cigarettes. Yet not once during the negotiations did we have serious criticism of the Chinese state monopoly and the enormous power. As I said, 44% of worldwide cigarettes. We now know that state monopolies account for well over half the cigarettes sold worldwide. And if you're a state monopoly, by definition, you are part of your government. And how can you separate the interests of the commerce and finance people getting a lot of income and profits from the health people? Usually the commerce and finance people win out. That debate never happened in the Framework Convention. And there's a line here or a line there about how we have to deal with it. But in effect, the tobacco control movement decided that it's much easier and more convenient to go for a couple of prominent companies. Obviously, Philip Morris was one. They probably sell 13, 14% of the world's cigarettes. So think about the other 84%. And if you ask me, how do I feel about the undermining? I wasn't naive. I don't think there's a single convention the WHO would have done where all interests are going to try and lobby. And lobbying is not illegal. It's projecting your interests. If they were doing it in an underhand way, that would be bad. And yes, there may be examples, but overall, I can say the final text of the Framework Convention really was a fairly good reflection of where the governments actually were able to tolerate progress.
I do want to be balanced, just obviously. So I've got the Reuters report in front of me, and I just do want to quote Philip Morris International, who said at the time, as a company in a highly regulated industry, speaking with governments is part of our everyday business. The fact that Reuters has seen internal emails discussing our engagement with governments does not make those interactions inappropriate. And Executive Andrew Cave has said that employees are under strict instructions to obey both the company's own conduct policies and local law in the countries where they operate, as reported by Reuters. I just wanted to mention that in the interest of balance. But you know, I see your point, and I do want to come on to sort of why I think you are so passionate. I don't want to presume, but why you're so passionate about this work, which is the risk reduction. You've spoken about it quite a bit. In a bit more detail, in the context of tobacco control, what is risk reduction? Why is it important?
Well, you know, I've grown up in the world of public health. Some of my most formative work, both in South Africa, but then at Hopkins, really led me to believe that when you're dealing with complex human behavior, it's never possible to simply take a black-white perspective on what is in the best interest of people. Most people, first of all, operate in what I call the gray zone. They may not be carrying out the optimal number of physical activity, but they're trying to do the best they can. They may not be eating the healthiest, but they're doing the best they can. And every time they take an extra 1,000 steps or they reduce a little bit of saturated fat, that's harm reduction. If we think about the way we have seatbelts in cars, that's harm reduction. The whole of the needle exchange, condom use, the whole of public health is basically covered in the area of harm reduction. Even the vaccines and the masks we're using for COVID-19 are not going to give you 100% protection. They're going to give you 90, 95, maybe even 85%. So when it came to tobacco control, we always asked the question, how could we lower risk And the mantra we carried out for so many decades was, there is no safe way to smoke. There's no safe level of using a cigarette, which was actually a lie, because we knew from the data that the more you smoke, the greater your risk. And yet we weren't saying to smokers, if you're a pack or 2-pack a day person, and you cut that down to 5 a day, you're going to cut your risk dramatically. For some reason, that was something we were almost verboten from talking about, yet it would cut your risk quite dramatically. Look at the epidemiology, it'll show you the numbers. Now you had this new opportunity to actually take the harmful stuff out, something that the industry had actually been writing about and hoping for in the internal documents from the 60s. You know, when they started down this road, they knew that nicotine was the stuff that kept you smoking, but it wasn't the stuff that was going to kill you. It was the combustion. And as the temperature goes up and the burning starts, you get the release of the nitrosamines and all the things that go on to kill you. So the dream was, how can we separate the two? And you had all sorts of efforts going on. And it was interesting that it wasn't a tobacco company. It was a Chinese a colleague, Han Ling, who was concerned about his father smoking in China, who came up with the initial e-cigarette idea. At the same time, Philip Morris and BAT and others were experimenting with these heated approaches. And meanwhile, we'd had snus on the market. So it was obvious that if you have the means of reducing death and disease, it's obligatory to take action. Now, it's particularly obligatory if you look at the numbers. And as an epidemiologist is somebody who looks at health issues, usually without empathy. We're the people who wipe the tears away and simply look at the death and the disease. And that's what matters. So there are 8 million people in the world who die every year because of tobacco. The number was 4 million when we started the convention, by the way, 20 years ago. 1 billion or so users of tobacco products in the world. If you are able, through these harm reduction products, to reduce that 8 million by 2, 3, 4 million a year, that would represent the biggest victory to public health, far greater than almost anything that one could do. That's what attracted me to it, the power of being able to implement prevention. And the frustration is that there's a growing group of people who accept the value of harm reduction, and they are being opposed by folk who refuse to actually come along for the ride and actually acknowledge that the cessation strategies we've tried haven't got us there yet.
It's sort of like they're very black and white.
It's black and white, but it's also, I think, a lack of sense of a temporal sense. The other characteristic of epidemiology,
lack of pragmatism, perhaps.
Well, I think, people also take the inappropriate way to looking at time. The thing about tobacco, like all chronic diseases, is that there's a long time period between the start of using the product and the presence of cancers, cardiovascular disease, and lung disease. But there's also a long period of time between when you switch from a tobacco smoking to a reduced risk product to see the benefits. A relatively long period of time. So if you, for example, look at improvement, if people switch today to an e-cigarette, they're not going to see the population benefit for a decade. But a decade is much shorter than the 5 decades it will take if no children ever picked up a cigarette and to see those effects. So I've also looked at how we focus so heavily on kids, appropriately, get them never to start. But the benefit of that flowing through a system is going to take 5 decades before we see the benefits in death and disease. Meanwhile, we're leaving their parents and their grandparents smoking at ages when we could bring their death rates down quite rapidly. But even if they're well into their 40s, 50s, and 60s, we know that people who quit or switch anyway through those decades will actually have measurable gains to their life expectancy and quality of life. And the public debate hasn't spoken about the value of adult life, and particularly from middle age on, as being able to be influenced until the pandemic. And now suddenly we realize people are vulnerable if they've got underlying health conditions. People are vulnerable and their lives are going to be at stake, particularly in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. Well, why don't we apply the same logic to the smokers whose lives could actually be improved dramatically.
I want to go to sort of e-cigarettes, electronic nicotine delivery systems, because there are some countries that have actually just banned them, which I think India is probably the most prominent example.
Yeah.
Why the hell did they do that?
Well, I think we've got to take the broad sweep of what has been happening. This is not an accident. These things happen. So I think that the heaviest funders of opposing harm reduction have been the Bloomberg philanthropies.
Always Bloomberg.
Well, Bloomberg is also the largest media company, I believe one of the largest employers of journalists through their business. So they have enormous power in the market. But their philanthropy, which is supposedly separate, let me give you a caveat. Bloomberg himself has done fantastic work on stimulating climate change debate and healthier cities and so on. And this is one area which most of us cannot understand why he has such a blockage on. Ethan Nadelman recently spoke about this and spoke about his policy on stop and frisk when he was the mayor of New York, and how that was a terrible policy, but it was one which years later he apologized for and said he got it wrong. The science he got wrong, the numbers he got wrong. We really are waiting and hoping that he'll actually admit he got this one wrong as well, because so much else he's doing is right. But the funding drives the question of India. So we know the big funding goes to the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, which focuses on kids in the US and increasingly globally, to the Union, which is another big charity based out of Paris, which used to be a tuberculosis agency. Between them, they have run the stories on how scary e-cigarettes are. And the story started going global. And of course, in India, they have a lot of grantees. And eventually it got through to government, and the cabinet decided to ban these e-cigarettes. I was there the day that it was banned. And the next day, the share price of the major tobacco company.
I remember.
So it was lunacy. We have many examples now around the world of bans being introduced. Now, the irony is, of course, that in India, e-cigarettes would probably appeal mainly to the higher end of the cigarette market, which is only about 10 to 15% of the tobacco market. The bulk of Indians are taking tobacco in the form of bidis and smokeless products, a wide range. And this goes back centuries, and there's a long, long history. So it probably won't have a big effect, but it's sending the wrong message, and it's sending a message of opposing harm reduction. We are seeing some reversals slowly. So, a place like Uruguay, which initially banned all of these products, heated tobacco products, have now reversed course. We suspect there'll be some other reversals. And the countries which have embraced harm reduction, we're starting to see the most rapid declines in combustible use that we've seen, that go faster than anything we could have achieved through WHO. So Japan, Korea, parts of Russia, Moscow, for example, a number of cities across East and Central Europe, all have a very high uptake, whether it's of heated tobacco or in some parts of Europe, e-cigarettes. The UK sits as a glowing example of the country that seems to be getting it right better than anybody else. And we can talk about the Royal College of Physicians report, which just came out a few weeks ago, now being, I think, the best global report, painting a vision of how, if doctors provide the advice about the value of e-cigarettes to their patients, particularly those with mental health problems, struggling to get off their cigarettes, we could actually see an acceleration of the end of combustible use.
Are you trying to tempt me into quitting?
I'm not tempting you to quitting. I'm saying to you that if you can lower your risk, either by quitting or if you don't want to, by using a reduced risk product, go for it. Your health will be improved.
We're going to get to that at the end.
Okay.
I didn't put it in the questions I sent to you because I wanted to catch you off guard. But I want to sort of talk about your broader career before we do that, because you're not a one-trick pony. You haven't just worked on tobacco control. You've worked on nutrition, as you've alluded to. and just curtailing the spread of non-communicable diseases in general. Well, what can you tell me about that kind of work, and what motivated you to get into all of this? Because public health is obviously, no one will deny it's important, but it's not particularly glamorous, it's not particularly sexy. Um, Unless you're Dr. Anthony Fauci, it's not really gonna make you famous. So what inspired you to get into it, and what are you proud of in terms of your achievements working in the field?
I think I first went to health in medicine, say in apartheid South Africa, because I thought that would be one way to really address some of the inequalities in the most effective way. And pretty soon, my colleagues and mentors advised me that I'd be best working as an epidemiologist and public health person than in a clinical setting, because I lacked empathy at the time to really be a good bedside doctor. So that got me into the numbers, the policies, dealing with large groups of people. I think I gained the empathy in later years, I hope. And then the question was, where do you devote your time? Where are the most intriguing and big opportunities? Well, the bulk of global health at the time was equated with infectious diseases, epidemics, tuberculosis, HIV/AIDS. And while I played some role in that in South Africa, because I led a center dealing with all of these public health issues, it was very obvious to me that the biggest growth was going to be in chronic diseases. And work I did over the years really highlighted the fact that physical activity, tobacco, alcohol, unhealthy diets, mental health, those were going to be the issues of our time going forward. And that we were moving from an era when childhood diseases were killing kids young to trying to find ways of not just having people live longer, but live healthier lives all the way through 80s, 90s. And so if you say, what are the things that I'm most proud of? I'd say certainly in South Africa, being able to create a center that put epidemiology at the center of policy making, and to have a group of mentors and colleagues who've gone on to be quite extraordinary. The person who's been leading a lot of the pandemic work now, Salim Abdul Karim from South Africa, was somebody who took over the center when I'd left all those years ago. I would say at WHO, the Framework Convention and the work we all did around that was obviously critical, but then we also put out another report because I was asked to move from tobacco to the broad chronic disease area by Brundtland. And we took on the food issue and produced a new set of guidelines for what are the things we should eat more of and what should we eat less of. In the process, we managed to unite the sugar industry, the salt industry, the processed meat industry, the red meat industry, the Cattlemen's Association, again, and the palm oil industry, all against us, because for those things we were saying, eat a little bit less. And the tragedy was that the fruit, nuts, vegetable folk were so quiet. They didn't actually jump up and down and say, you're great, because we're advocating for their work. That was an interesting process. It got us to see, I think for the first time, the power of some of the, not the food companies directly or alone, but the food, agricultural, political things that lay behind it. And if you thought the tobacco industry was a tough one, the palm oil industry is tougher. And I think to this day, I think people have been very fearful of treading on the toes of the palm oil industry, even though the impact on cardiovascular disease is modest but serious, but it's devastating to the environment of Indonesia and Malaysia and many parts of the world.
Between food and tobacco, I can't imagine you've got many friends in agriculture.
Well, actually, I do, because I then went to PepsiCo, and I got to see, I think, and it was very useful for a public health person to go into the belly of the beast. We were saying simply, Pepsi should just stop selling this, stop selling that. And once you're inside the company, you realize that there is a strong intent to do the right thing. The question is how you use business models to achieve that change. Mm-hmm. And they're pesky things called consumers who love salty, sugary, fatty things. And if you want to get them to switch, you've got to do it in ways either through stealth or through better design or better marketing. And a full combination of all of those is underway in different ways. I'd say one of the proudest things I was able to do at PepsiCo was to work with my colleagues on a set of nutrition guidelines around what are the limits that we should be having on salt, sugar, fat, all of these things, and the healthy products, which to some extent is still a guiding way in which products are starting to come out. And it's a long journey. It's I remember when we started the work on salt, there was a WHO at the time was saying it's the cheapest thing in the world to improve blood pressure is to lower salt in all foods worldwide. And that sounds very nice until you realize, well, we don't know where the salt comes from in the diet of many countries. In many parts of the world, it's coming from bread. 60% of salt is coming from bread. And bread is not made by one or two manufacturers in countries. It's made by a myriad of players out there. Getting them to change their process was going to be complex. The UK government, through the Food Standards Authorities, was probably one of the exemplary ones to bring together the cheese manufacturers and the bread manufacturers, all of them to tackle their own challenges. But the public perception was it's all salty snacks that's driving salt. In fact, salty snacks constitute a tiny fraction of the salt burden in any country in the world. Yet the wording meant that the blame was placed in the wrong place. But I got to see the power of large companies. And if you've got a company which is serving 1 billion, 2 billion consumers daily, and you're able to make a tiny adjustment in the salt or take the trans fats out, you're going to impact people dramatically. Yet the public health people will say, well, it's just got to be done by edict or law or regulation, which is not the way you actually achieve sustainable long-term impact.
Do you ever just consider, walking around and taking burgers out of people's hands or like batting cigarettes from them? Do you ever just consider doing that?
No, I didn't.
Just sort of eventually one of them would just go, all right, I'll quit. Just stop following me around.
Well, I think that, again, you say what are the things I've really been proud of. I think working with Vitality was one of the most intellectually exciting parts of my career because it brought a completely different set of insights and used the notions of nudge, of understanding what truly drives behavior. What's the balance of incentives and disincentives that affect people? How do you deal with the fact that people live in this gray zone? And if you can push them up just a little bit, it can have a really big impact on their health outcomes. And very much embedded in the thoughts of the consumers. And unlike what we started with, where there was no link or there's been no recent discussion between smokers and policymakers, in the world of Vitality, there's an intimate, permanent discussion between the users of the programs and how it's affecting them and the way in which it actually gets adjusted. And the result is that the people who get more engaged in the Vitality program live longer, healthier lives, and the company gets more profitable doing it. It's a win-win for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, with all seriousness, because I don't want to treat the discussion totally with levity, but the nuanced approach to me is the one that does make the most sense. You've got to reach people where they are.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, you're an epidemiologist, you're a numbers guy, but most people, myself included, they don't see the numbers and think that makes me want to change my lifestyle. You've got to meet people where they live, so to speak. So the nuanced approach that you describe, the complexities of it, is absolutely fascinating. It's been lovely to have your insights. Before I let you go, Doctor, I'm going to give you an option to encourage me to either give up smoking or to reduce. You have a minute.
I'd have to know how long you've been smoking and how heavy do you smoke a day. Can you tell me that?
I've smoked now for about, I think, five years or so. And I smoke around 40, 45, sometimes more. That's how many I smoke a day.
Well, I'd say to you, think of your future health beyond 40. And the good news is that a lot of the damage that might be being done by being a 40-a-day smoker will actually reduce fairly dramatically if you opt for either an e-cigarette or heated tobacco product or nicotine pouch. It's likely, given your level of smoking, you would succeed far better on any of those than you would on trying to go cold turkey or to trying to use a patch or gum. Clearly, you've got a reasonable degree of nicotine dependence, and I'm sure you're getting some benefit or you're feeling a benefit of the smoke early in the morning and late in the day. And many of the products out there now give you a similar effect, whether it's a pouch, which gives it quickly in the mouth, or e-cigarette or heated tobacco product. And we know the chemistry, we know the brain effects, and the risk reduction will probably be in the order of, as the Royal College says, of 95, 98, 99%. You'll feel it pretty soon. Your activity level will feel better, your energy levels will feel better, but down the line, your risk of all the ghastly things that can come will be quite dramatically cut, and you'll start seeing those risks coming down within a few years. So for you and for your partners and loved ones and people you associate with, I think they'll all see and they'll smell a far better person as they come into the room. And when you do that, launder your clothes, all of them, and go to the dentist and have a really good dental hygiene program. And notice you won't have to do that for a very long time.
Well, thank you for that. It's very, very clear, concise, and a very sort of respectful, for want of a better word. It's a very respectful way of trying to encourage somebody. And hopefully one day. Don't think I'm ready for it yet. No, I think my head would have to be in it, but maybe somebody watching this will benefit from that advice as well. Dr. Derek Yach is the president of the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World. Thank you very much, sir. Been a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks. Keep well.
From Why Is This a Podcast? I'm Kieran Watts. Join us next time.